If you recall, back during my look at God of War Ragnarok, I expressed that Resident Evil 4 Remake is the only other game that I've considered myself in any way hyped for since 2013. And trust me, that's definitely still the case. Resident Evil 4 is one of those games I played back in high school and only recently rediscovered my love for it. Having been perpetually busy for pretty much my entire adult life, a really long game like Resident Evil 4 hasn't really been in the books, but thanks to its wide availability, I found myself playing Resident Evil 4 on my scarce free time recently and loved it all the same. As a matter of fact, Resident Evil as a series is something that I've only recently properly gotten into, and I think the series is fantastic. It's had its ups and downs, don't get me wrong, and the whole horror thing has been in varying degrees of flux since the very beginning, but as a whole, I really enjoy Resident Evil. That said, unlike God of War Ragnarok, which is a sequel to a game I already thought was really good, Resident Evil 4 Remake is a different kettle of fish altogether, because like it or not, the original Resident Evil 4 as we now have to call it is more than just a game. It's a tentpole fixture in the entire history of the medium. This entire style of over-the-shoulder third-person shooters was codified by Resident Evil 4. It was a direct inspiration for a lot of games for the next 10 years or so. This is an undeniable fact, just as Doom or Mario 64 were massive inspirations for many games back in the 90s. So it's hard for me to think how you can go back to Resident Evil 4 and recapture that same lightning. I don't think it's possible, really. But then again, I guess the question is, do you really need to? Because the original Resident Evil 4 is still there, as are all the games that it inspired. As a matter of fact, Resident Evil 4 is probably the most re-released game ever. What was once touted as a GameCube exclusive has been re-released on pretty much everything with a screen, including a Brazilian console called the Zeebo. And just for the record, that port is absolutely hilarious. You need to check it out. So I guess the question is, what's even the point of remaking a game that's not only already good, but still widely available? Well, why not? The fact is, I think if something's only justification for existing is being good, that's more than enough, because the idea of taking Resident Evil 4 and modernizing it with design sensibilities of today in mind is a perfectly reasonable idea. I don't know what modernizing Resident Evil 4 really means, and there are certain things that I'd be somewhat against overall, and we'll talk about that later, but I've thought about this and I've realized that I'm more than willing to hear them out on whatever wild and wacky ideas they have in taking Resident Evil 4 and viewing it through the lens of hindsight. And part of that is the fact that I just trust Capcom. I think Capcom is one of the few developers these days that I can give the benefit of the doubt to. They're a far cry from who they were back in 2013. That is to say, a company that had actively and deliberately spent the previous few years not giving their fans what they wanted, and as a result were on the verge of bankruptcy. But it seems sometime in the mid to late 2010s, they collectively realized that they could get people to buy their stuff if they just made good games that people wanted to play. Devil May Cry 5, Mega Man 11, the modern Resident Evil series, Monster Hunter, even Dead Rising was going pretty strong there for a while. You also have things like their continued efforts to support Street Fighter, bring over the Japanese exclusive Ace Attorney games, support new IP, their continued efforts to re-release their backlog on modern platforms, both as standalone games and collections. Basically, Capcom has really turned themselves around in my eyes. They're still a major corporate conglomerate and therefore don't actually care about you, but as far as what we've come to expect from major game developers and publishers, they're one of the good ones. At least as good as you can get these days. You can't trust them to be moral, but you can definitely trust them to make good games, generally speaking, which is the primary reason they get the benefit of the doubt. So with that, I have high hopes for Resident Evil 4 Remake. It's weird that Capcom has, out of the blue, decided to start remaking their backlog of Resident Evil games. The first Resident Evil remake was made all the way back in 2002 on the GameCube, so it really didn't seem like that big of a deal when Resident Evil 2 Remake came out more than 15 years later. I'm not sure if the plan was always to do an RE3 make, but I'd imagine the universal praise that RE2 make got only bolstered their decision, and then the rumors started circulating about RE4 make. Of course, it was a bit odd that they decided to skip straight to 4 because despite being the fourth numbered entry, there are several entries between 3 and 4. Dead Aim, Survivor, and most notably Code Veronica, which is considered to be the fourth core entry in the series. But it made sense to me. Outside of the core fanbase, not too many people are familiar with those games. Resident Evil 4, on the other hand, is not only a well-known game, it's arguably the most famous Capcom game to ever exist. So from a business perspective, it's entirely justified to skip straight to the one people know. It's especially beneficial because unlike the decade gap between the remake of RE1 and the remake of RE2 that meant you couldn't really have the former play into the latter without confusing a lot of people, Resident Evil 2 Remake is still fresh in a lot of people's minds, having only been made a few years ago at time of writing. So the benefit of making a remake for RE4 is that the game might actually be better informed by RE2 make. As good as the OG RE4 was, it had come out a full 7 or so years after the first appearance of Leon, and on an entirely different console to boot, so it was a slight bit unreasonable to expect the non-hardcore audience to remember who he was or what his character was, which is probably why they didn't bother much. He practically becomes an entirely different character between Resident Evil 2 and 4, but now that 2 and 4 have come out relatively close to each other, you can have Leon's characterization tie into his previous adventure, and that appears to be where they're going with this if the trailer is anything to go off of. What with Leon describing how haunted he is from all the stuff he went through in RE2 make. This is fertile grounds for good storytelling, and I can dig that like a shallow grave. The other thing this trailer gives us an indication of is that Resident Evil 4 Remake looks to be going in a more horror-based direction than the original, which is not to say the original wasn't a horror game, but I wouldn't really describe it as scary. Relentlessly intense for sure, and it had a few moments of genuine terror, but I didn't find myself cowering behind my controller in the same way that I would if I was playing something like Silent Hill 2. But if they're deliberately trying to evoke a true horror atmosphere, I'm down with that. It takes the game in a different direction while also sticking true to the series' roots. It's also nice that they're making an effort to differentiate the old game from the remake. I used to be wholly against the concept of remakes on principle because I thought, why should we remake something that already exists when we can just make something new? I think in hindsight that was a take that lacked all nuance. I think it's arrogant to think that a piece of media needs to justify itself to my beliefs before it can exist. Because why should an artist restrict themselves at all? No media needs to exist for any other reason than because someone wanted to make it, and if it ends up sucking, then better luck next time, I guess. That said, if it were just to be a shot-for-shot remake of the original with shiny new graphics, that might have been a bit disappointing, because unlike the original Resident Evil, 4 was far enough along technologically that being the exact same game might have been a bit redundant, especially when the game is already available everywhere, and there's literally PC mods to update the game with modern graphics. So the best thing that they can do here is take what's there and take it from a different angle. Which I trust they will do, because aside from having done that with the previous 2 remakes, the trailer also gives me that impression, and I'm not against them changing things if it makes the experience better. For me, creative changes in remakes falls into one of 2 camps. On one hand, you have superfluous changes that don't actually matter in the grand scheme of things. These usually amount to physical redesigns or general visual differences that may have a minor impact on the mood or setting, but ultimately don't matter, can be ignored, or wouldn't even be noticed. And the second is classified as changes that actively alter the game in a noticeable way. Not necessarily positive or negative. A good example of this that I go back to is the Insane trilogy. When the game launched, it had gimped-ass hitboxes which made the whole game pointlessly more difficult. It was a fundamental alteration that completely rebalanced the game, and not in a good way. But as far as changes that don't matter in the grand scheme of things, look no further than RE3 Remake itself. Jill's redesign doesn't actually alter the game in any meaningful way. It's entirely superficial and as such can be classified under who gives a damn. So in RE4 Remake, them giving Ashley pants can be classified under who cares? And if anyone actually considers that a big deal, well, I guess those who mind don't matter and those who matter don't mind. Personally, I find it weird on principle that it's entirely possible to stare up a woman's skirt in the original, especially one that's ostensibly 20 or 21 but looks 16, but that's just me. I'm not part of the same culture that made this game. However, if for example they made Ashley a gun-toting badass who flips around like a ninja and acts as a true gameplay companion with all the same skills and abilities as Leon, that would probably alter the gameplay as well as the entire internal logic of the game in a very unwanted way. But I think Capcom has been good about keeping things that matter either unchanged or changed for the better in recent games. With the exception of things that were changed due to circumstances out of their control or not quite in their control, such as running short on dev time. I'm not exactly sure what I want them to change to make the experience different and potentially better, but I'm excited to find out. There's one thing I'm slightly iffy about that to my knowledge has been neither confirmed nor denied, and that's the idea that they might give you the ability to walk and shoot at the same time, because for me, the inability to defend yourself on the move was paramount to the atmosphere of RE4. Without that, it might end up lessening the game's overall quality, but then again, we don't know if they're going to do that, and for all we know, if they do, they might end up putting something else in there to compensate. Besides, even if they do something that fundamentally alters the atmosphere or the gameplay of the original is still there, widely available. So if it ever means that much, you can just hop on the version that you prefer. unless they take the original versions down from all digital storefronts, which is not unheard of when it comes to remakes and remasters. Capcom has never done this to my knowledge, but other companies have, and it's usually done in favor of an inferior remaster or remake. If they did take the original game down, they'd be playing with fire. It would not only sink all my goodwill for the remake, but it would sink all my goodwill for Capcom as a whole. Because aside from denying people something that's been widely available for many years, you'd also be tacitly admitting that you don't have enough faith in your remake to stand up on its own. But we don't know if they're going to do that, so I give them the benefit of the doubt for now. It's still my greatest concern though, as unfounded and possibly unlikely as it may be, but I think the one thing that people are collectively wary about is the idea that this game might be a glorified DLC akin to RE3 Remake, but I think those fears are a bit unfounded. The original Resident Evil 3, whether you like the game or not, wasn't exactly brimming with creativity. It was basically more the same with some new ideas sprinkled in. Meaning the legacy isn't as strong as the other games, so it's not exactly damning with perfection if the 3 Remake isn't a masterpiece. Not to say RE3 was bad, it just wasn't as groundbreaking or iconic to a general audience as some other games in the series. 4, on the other hand, it's one of the most groundbreaking games of all time, and Capcom has to know this considering how many times they've re-released it. How many times have they re-released the original version of 3? So clearly Capcom as a whole knows the legacy of RE4 as well as anyone, and as such should know that RE4 Remake has to be as good, if not better, than the original. There's no half-assing this one without throwing away all their goodwill that they've accumulated. And that doesn't take a genius to understand. So I think they understand better than anyone just how much care and attention this game needs. And that's evident just by how long the development cycle has taken. The RE4 Remake was rumored ages before it was officially announced. It was considered gaming's worst kept secret. Plus the bombastic cinematic trailer, the announcement date nearly a full calendar year before the game is set to come out, they are treating this like the big deal that it should be. As opposed to the 3 Remake, which I didn't even know was a thing until like a week before it came out at the time. So basically what I'm saying is, if you're afraid that Resident Evil 4 Remake is going to be underwhelming in the same way that Resident Evil 3 Remake was, worry not. It could very well be underwhelming, but it won't be underwhelming because Capcom isn't putting their best foot forward. At least that's how it appears. Of course, everything I've said so far is basically just speculation. The only thing we've seen so far of this game is the announcement trailer, and there's really not much you can get from that other than the tone and maybe the character designs, so it remains to be seen what this game is going to look like when it's all said and done. But I'm optimistic, so I guess to answer the question that the video title asks, probably not, but you never know. I guess the question at this point is, what should they do next? Should they go straight into doing a Resident Evil 5 remake? Should they work on the backlog a bit? Should they just pack in this whole remake lark? Well, if I'm being honest, I would like to see them cover the backlog slightly. Especially Code Veronica. Now, I've never beaten Code Veronica because I just don't find it very fun. So I've consulted my Resident Evil expert who's a resident in my residence, and he explained to me just how important Code Veronica is to the lore. It's not the most vital thing in the universe, but it is important, showing what happened to Chris after the first game, what happened to Albert Wesker after the first game, and more importantly how he got his powers, as well as showing us the history of Umbrella. So it does feel like there's a small piece to the puzzle missing here, and obviously it wouldn't sell the same as the other remakes, but it's worth it to at least fill the gap even if it only ends up being a budget game. And as for the other RE games, I don't know. There's a backlog for sure, but without entering the HD era, it's hard to know exactly what would benefit from a remake, and more to the point, which ones would sell. Even though it's non-canon, I would like to see what a remake of Resident Evil Gaiden could look like, because having seen some gameplay, that's definitely a game that was impressive, but lacked in some areas due to the technology. So it would be interesting to see where a reinterpretation could take it. Maybe you could even fit it into the canon series. Then this would probably be something that would be better in the next 5 to 10 years or so, but I would be interested to see how audiences would react to retooled versions of Resident Evil 5 and 6, because I seem to remember those games not being well received at the time, especially 6, but I'm wondering if time and distance have done them any favors. Truth be told, I'm familiar enough with the series, but I'm by no means an expert, so I would be interested in understanding exactly what it is about those games that people don't like, and more to the point see how they can benefit from hindsight. With that said, I got nothing else to add on this matter, so we'll see how things go as we get closer to release date. Let me know what you think of this remake so far in the comments section, and don't forget to like and subscribe. I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Peace!